Greetings, everybody. My name is Tim Kern. I'm the director of the Yadunandan Center for India Studies. I'm also the director of the secondary education program here at California State University, Long Beach. And I want to warmly welcome you all this evening to the 18th annual Uka and Nalini Solanki Foundation Lecture. Tonight's Solanki Lecture will in fact be the first structured as a conversation between our distinguished speaker, Anand Giridharadas, and our university president, Dr. Jane Connolly. It's also, as you probably figured out, it's also our first virtual Solanki lecture. So before we start, I would like to thank the following folks for all their hard work in organizing this event tonight. We've got a good crowd. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Dr. Mihir Pandya from the Department of Anthropology and the Assistant Director of the Yadunandan Center, who did the lion's share of getting our event this evening off the ground. And I really want to thank him for that. I also want to thank Charade, the Center Student Assistant, and rumored to be an exemplary student in the CSULB Department of International Studies. I'd also like to thank Dr. Pravina Cooper from Comparative Literature, who planned a number of events during the year. And lastly, I'd like to thank none other than Debbie Hildreth Pisarczyk, who's the communication specialist in the College of Liberal Arts. And she'll be sort of our, what I'd like to call our Zoom DJ tonight, who's going to control the playlist of who surfaces in and out of the Zoom ether, so to speak. Of course, I also want to especially thank the Solanki family for making this event and all Yadunandan Center events possible. In the virtual absence of a written program made available to attendees of this lecture in the past, I'd like to provide a brief history of the center. The Yadunandan Center for India Studies was formally inaugurated in 2005 by a generous donation from Uka and Nalini Solanki. The center is named after Nalini's great-great-grandfather, who was an early advocate of education in Northern India. The center promotes the study of and engagement with India's cultures, communities, and histories, with additional emphasis on the South Asian diaspora, as well as supporting to improve the means by which India and South Asia are taught in the public schools. It is this endowment from the Solanki family which established the annual Uka Nalini Solanki Lecture. I do personally want to thank the Solanki family for their generosity and support. And I also want to thank them for their always excellent and good spirit and enthusiasm. I'm very happy to see that many family members are in fact in the audience tonight. I also want to note how very hard it is to comprehend that Uka's passing took place now over 2 years. It just seems incredible that it's been 2 years. He's very much missed by all, and this event and future Solanki lectures will always provide the opportunity to remember him. Let me finish with a brief review of the center events that took place over the last year in these extraordinary times. With the onset of what I like to call the Great Disruption in March of 2020, we had to cancel the Solanki lecture that was scheduled to take place at the conference center in the Pyramid with, as per usual, a catered reception of Indian snacks and a book signing. All was in order last March, and I recollect that Mihir and I were confident that even though the event was canceled, it still might take place face-to-face last fall, or at worst this spring. How little we knew and anticipated. I have been to my office only a few times in the past year, and it now serves as a time capsule for the week of March 6, 2020, with our striking publicity flyer for Anand's lecture still on my door and 3 boxes of his book, Winners Take All, under my desk. We will, in fact, be soon sending an email out to those of you who are interested in a copy, and we will post you copies of his book. However, my plan to Grubhub samosas and pakoras to all attendees tonight proved to be untenable. That said, we have discovered that Zoom brought some advantages in terms of center programming. No concerns about finding parking, for one. It also provided the opportunity to have presentations direct from speakers in India, at least those happy enough to speak to us early in the Indian morning. And this included talks on the initial COVID crisis in India, as well as another on current challenges facing the Indian higher education sector. We also had Zoom panels and presentations that addressed a wide variety of other topics, including contemporary California Sikh communities, the writings of Salman Rushdie, and the role of yoga and Hinduism in contemporary American festival culture. I'm also happy to report that with support from the Solanki Foundation, The Teach India program will be resurrected this summer with a week-long summer Zoom workshop for 30 selected world history teachers that will address the teaching of early modern South Asia and world history, and to do so through culturally responsive pedagogies. Finally, I want to thank you all for attending this evening. I know many of us continue to suffer from the new affliction called Zoom fatigue. Let us keep positive thoughts that our next Solanki lecture might be actual once again. So now for the program. I'm first going to ask Dr. David Wallace, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, to say a few words, and then Debbie, will turn the Zoom over to Dr. Norbert Scher, Professor of English and member of the Yadunandan Center Faculty Advisory Board. Norbert's going to introduce our distinguished speaker as well as President Connolly. Given the size of our audience this evening, attendees will be muted and people should input their questions for Anand through the chat that Norbert will then monitor to facilitate the Q&A. So with that, it's now my pleasure just to present to you Dean Wallace.
Hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be here. I was talking with Tim earlier this week and saying that I'd planned to put on a tie for this event for the first time in a year, but unfortunately 2 days ago I hurt my shoulder and I can't quite manage a tie. But I did manage to get into a jacket, which feels very festive as I'm sitting at my dining room table. I look forward to this event every year for 3 reasons. The first is it's just a signature event for the college. It brings together the university community, K through 12 educators and students and interested members of the community in a way that I wish we were able to do more often. Second reason that I look forward to this event is because, as I said to some of you before, despite the fact that I have a PhD, I have discovered that my own understanding of India and the region and their importance, both historically and in the world, is terribly underdeveloped. So I look forward every year to correcting that problem just a little bit at this event. And the third reason I always enjoy this event is because I enjoy getting to have interactions with the Solanki family, although that's a bit of a challenge this year. And I just want to echo what Tim said, that I really miss Uka at this event. No matter what kind of day or week I was having when the Solanki lecture came along, I knew that I would see Uka. Uka would give me a big smile, a firm handshake, and probably tell me a couple of dad jokes that I'd be a little slow to get. I want to thank the Solanki family for their generosity. I want to welcome you all on behalf of the College of Liberal Arts. And let me invite all of you to join me in a virtual round of applause to thank the Solanki family for their many contributions.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dean Wallace. Can you guys hear me? I can't quite tell. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. My name is Norbert Scher. I'm a professor in the English department. I am going to be moderating some of this event. So again, as Tim said, please put questions you might have in the chat. I will do my best to address as many of those as possible to Anand and Jane. But obviously, I can't guarantee that everybody will be, heard, since we will probably have lots of very interesting questions. And now I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers in about 5 minutes. Dr. Jane Close Connolly serves as the 7th president of California State University, Long Beach. Before arriving at CSULB in 2014, she was the interim chancellor of the University of California, Riverside, and previous to that, she held leadership positions at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Texas A&M University, and the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. As the author, co-author, or editor of over 120 books, articles, and book chapters, Jane is also an accomplished academic in the area of psychology, and more specifically, positive psychology. Her research and development efforts in school safety, teacher quality, and student achievement have been supported by over $20 million in external federal, state, and private funds. Here at CSULB, Jane has had a great impact in making our campus a national leader in social mobility for our students. Depending on which particular ranking you read, CSULB is now somewhere between #1 and #5 in the nation in terms of providing social mobility for students. Jane has created both the President's Commission on Equity and Change and the President's Commission on Sustainability, so she is leading in the area of climate change as well. Her efforts are all bundled in her Initiative for the Future, which all of us on campus know well as Beach 2030. So please join me in welcoming President Jane Close Connolly tonight. And now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Anand Giridharadas. On his website, Anand calls himself simply a writer. Indeed, he is the author of 3 books. His first book, India Calling, from 2011, was about visiting the India his parents had left. His second, The True American, from 2014, told the story of a Muslim immigrant's campaign in Texas, of all places, to spare the white supremacist who had tried to kill him from death row. The True American has been optioned for a movie, which would be very exciting. Anand's most recent book is the New York Times bestseller, Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World, from 2018, which explores what economic and political structures are perceived to be best suited and which are actually best suited to improve our world. Winners Take All, which is now available in paperback, will be the jumping off point for our discussion tonight. But Anand is also a writer in the larger sense that he works in print journalism, radio, TV, and digital media. He appears regularly on networks and shows such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, Morning Joe, and The Daily Show. He has contributed many, many items to the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New Republic, and the Atlantic. His most recent article in the Atlantic, Welcome to the New Progressive Era, about the Biden administration's somewhat surprising turn towards progressive policies, actually just came out yesterday, I believe. He also has his own newsletter called The Ink, which you can conveniently find at the.ink. And I will try to put that in the chat, and I encourage you all to check that out. In all of these venues, Anand addresses urgent and current issues such as our crises in racial justice, climate, health, the economy, and democracy. To close my introduction, I'll just mention 3 things that really impress me about Anand's writing. First, his books and articles are always cogent and excellently researched in statistics as well as human stories, so his arguments and conclusions are always compelling. Secondly, and I say this as an English professor, his prose is just absolutely innovative, joyful, and sparkling. He uses clear, transparent language as well as beautiful rhetorical figures like the timely metaphor of a vaccine against the virus of fatalism, the neologism of the adverb saxophonely, the chiasmus of a radicalized moderate case for radical change, or the zeugma of balancing the holding their own with the holding their nose. It's just brilliant. Third, one of the absolute strengths of his writing is that he almost always does a double take. He shares how he first reacted to a situation or information, and then explains how he revisited and reflected on that first reaction to come to a kind of epiphany of a more nuanced understanding. If more people looked at the world that way, I think we could all benefit. So please join me in welcoming to the 2021 Solanki Lecture of the Yadunandan Center for India Studies at CSULB, Mr. Anand Giridharadas.
Well, thank you, Norbert, for that great introduction. It's fabulous to have an English professor doing this. And I get the joy of having a conversation now with Anand. And Anand, I wanted to start by saying I had the chance to, most of our discussion will be about your latest book, Winners Take All, but I had the chance to read your first book, I guess, India Calling, and then The True American. And what struck me about those two is that you recount the story of journeys. First, maybe your journey to India, but also the journey of India, from maybe the way you remembered it to what it really is, and how that has, changed your understanding of what was around you. And then, of course, the journey of these two men highlighted in The True American, the journey of actually the victim of this violent crime to a level of great success in America, representing kind of the agile America, as you call it, and the perpetrator of that crime, who eventually is killed by the state for that crime, despite his victims' fervent advocacy to save his life. So I'm wondering if you could talk, of course you can talk about anything you want. We're very interested in anything you have to say, but I wonder about your own journey to the topic of the book, Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. Can you talk about that journey as well?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really it's an honor for me to be part of this, and thank you for everyone who's involved in putting it together. Thank you to Norbert for that introduction, which really, I wish I'm going to try to track down a video of that, because it understood my work better than I understand it. So I really, only an English professor can do that.
That's right.
And I wish I could be there with you all, but very happy that we can add one more Zoom call to all of your days. The Winners Take All, I often have said that all of my books begin as some kind of subconscious irritation with the world, or something's bothering you that you don't yet have an intellectual processing of, and then there's like a million things that we all have like that in our life, and many of them just stay as subconscious irritations, and some of them rise up to the level of maybe greater irritations, but we become conscious of them. We think about them, we read about them, we talk to people about them, and Winners Take All kind of grew out of that. So I think it was two things. It was watching the thesis of the book, first of all, just in a sentence, is that the richest and most powerful people in the world do a tremendous amount of generosity these days, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's social enterprise, whether it's social venture capital, whether it's Tom's Shoes, give one, get one, $3 for cancer at Walgreens, Jeff Bezos, not paying people enough, but then doing, free preschool for the kids of the people he doesn't pay enough, so on and so forth. All these people are doing a lot of nice things, but they're generally upholding a lot of the systems and structures that cause a lot of the problems they laterally seek to solve at tiny scale. That's the thesis. And so I came onto it in terms of a journey because I watched, in some ways, many people of my generation, from the time we were kind of in our 20s to the time we were in our mid 30s and had kind of gotten on a certain track. I watched a lot of people go from real idealism about how you change the world through politics, through policy, through activism, through systems, in our 20s. And then as people got older, I watched more and more people kind of fall like trees to this ideology as I started to understand it. An ideology that says, no, you don't change the world the way it's been changed in the past. The way you change the world is through business. The way you change the world is through markets. That was the old fuddy-duddy way of making change, through government and policy. Government's dead, policy's dead, tired, slow. It's the DMV. The way you make change now is an ice cream company that gives back. The way you make change now is by paying people as little as possible in a business and then donating a fraction of what you saved by not paying them enough to some foundation to cure the diseases they got because they were overworked and didn't have good preventative care, so on and so forth. And so I watched as my generation was seduced by this, what felt like a fraudulent story about how you change the world. And then I had a more specific experience that really propelled me very specifically into writing the book, which was I was invited into this kind of benevolent open secret society called the Aspen Institute, which you may or may not have heard of. And the Aspen Institute, you know, does a lot of different things in national security and education and various other things. But one of the things it does is a fellowship, a young leaders fellowship. I was named a young leader in this, you know, under 40 group of people, 21 people come together. And most of these people are actually business people. So it's part of this theory, right? You got to get business people are how you make change now. You get them together, you make them read a little Gandhi, you make them read a little, you know, Plato, sit in a room, talk, share your feelings, and hopefully these business people will go out into the world and make a difference, make change. Well, they sort of discovered along the way that 20 business people in a room, just business people, could be a little boring, a little stale. So they started to invite a few other non-business people to spice it up a little bit. So I was the Indian spice in my class of 21 people. And it was a very nice group of people, but we would go to Aspen, which is this beautiful, beautiful mountain town in Colorado. And we would talk about, how do we solve the racial wealth gap? How do we have a more vibrant social media without the toxicity? How do, you know, every like beautiful kind of solution brainstorming you could imagine. And the issue, Jane, was that I started to look around the table and I started to realize that a lot of the people in the room with me had just flown into Aspen from causing the problem that we were now solving. Like they were literally in a meeting 5 hours before making the problem worse. Then they flew to Aspen and sat in a panel on, you know, how to make it better. They were literally in a meeting at Coke or Pepsi talking about how to thwart schools trying to keep vending machines out. And then they were flying to Aspen to talking about, you know, nutrition for Black children in poor communities and how to fight diabetes. Or they were literally in meetings at Facebook trying to fend off the government from regulating toxicity, disinformation, white supremacy, Nazism. And then they were flying to Aspen to talk about how to make democracy more vital. So one year they asked me to give a speech there. Don't worry, this is not going to happen tonight. But they asked me to give a speech and to this group of fellows in this program about actually my True American book, about something totally different. And I kind of had one of these epiphanies, as Norbert said, and I realized I'm going to give a different speech. And I'm not going to tell them, but I'm going to give a different speech. And I prepared this speech deep from my heart, lovingly suggesting that if they were interested in solving the world's problems, they should start with them, because they were the problem. The people in that room, the captains of industry, the owners of, you know, these big companies, CEOs of these big giant corporations, Goldman Sachs, Facebook, these kinds of organizations represented in that room, were in many ways engaged in what I call the charade of making the world worse by day, and then proudly, loudly seeking to tinily repair it by philanthropic moonlight. And I wrote the book to expose that con.
So how did that speech go over?
I have never seen anything like it, because it was a weird combination, probably because of social pressure. You know, you got to imagine, this is a group of people who wants to believe that they're on the good side of things. So I got a weird combination of icy stares and a standing ovation. And so they were standing, they were clapping. The clapping was a little slow, but they were clapping, but the stares were icy. Later that night, I went to, there was a bar, hotel bar in the, you know, in the lobby of the hotel. And I kind of stopped by on my way up. And this guy is a private equity guy, not a rare occupation in that circle, comes up to me. He shakes my hand. Nice, like kind of congratulatory, firm, private equity man handshake. And as I'm shaking it, he says, "You're an asshole." So that's kind of how it went.
Yeah, so you got your message across.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and I think I'm oversimplifying it. I got a lot of positive feedback in the days to come. I mean, days after that, and years after that. A lot of those people know it. And a lot of those people told me they know it. And I was able to go on to write a book about it over the next few years because a lot of those people talked to me, not specifically the people in the room, some of them, but also other people. Look, if you were at Goldman Sachs in the run up to 2008, you know what y'all did better than we know what y'all did.
Yeah. Yeah.
You may not talk about it all the time. You may not tell your kids or grandkids, but come on. I mean, there's nothing the New York Times knows about that you don't know better if you were exposed to that stuff. So they know. It takes there's a certain level of, sociopath that can be involved in that stuff and actually feel no guilt. But a lot of those people actually feel tremendous guilt. I mean, I know people who work at Facebook. I don't think today they feel incredibly proud of themselves as being part of a good thing. People's lives are complicated. It's not always easy to see your way out of something, but a lot of the people in the structures that I write about know how rotten to the core some of these institutions are. And a lot of the writing I was able to do was because a lot of these people talked to me as some combination of their effort to make a small change by at least opening these things up. I always say leaking is a form of reform, and as a form of penance, I think, for a lot of them. I had people in that world taking me, to a quiet dinner somewhere. I remember a guy who had been a house guest at the Google founder's house. They have a back house in their house or something like that. And he'd been saying that he's like a good friend of the Google founder. One of the Google founders lived in their house, right? And he, having been their house guest, he'd been privy to some information about how they structure their taxes to avoid, taxes. And after having been their house guest, still their close friend, takes me to dinner and explains to me in detail how they do it. So that's quite interesting. He's not going to get in trouble. It's not going to come back to him. That's not even really in the book in a specific way. But a lot of these people know, as people must have in feudal England, as people must have at the top of the Indian caste system, as people must have in Alabama in 1834 or 1934. There are some people who are just completely morally oblivious. But I think a lot of people in these systems, in this age of inequity that we've been living in, that has produced such terrifying results that we can talk about tonight, I think a lot of people in these systems, even deep in the bowels of these systems, know that they are standing on a kind of mountain that is morally indefensible.
Wow. Yeah. That's so interesting. I was going to ask you about, the dissonance and is some of these so-called charitable efforts, the penance. You can tell I was raised a Catholic. I understand that whole thing very well,
I've described some of these things as the kind of modern day papal indulgences.
Yeah.
Which was, the thing that actually, one of the things that helped prompt the Reformation.
Yes, exactly. Well, you mentioned Google and Facebook, and I wondered whether this rise, what does it do, or does it, the rise of these large technology companies, does that have to do with the story you're telling in this book, or are there narratives emanating from places like Silicon Valley, reframing elite notions of what the social good is? So that whole
Absolutely. I mean, Silicon Valley is in multiple ways, a kind of biopsy of this age of plutocracy. It really, if you just look at Silicon Valley, you can get to so many of the different things and phases of how the system works that I write about in the book. So for starters, there is the claim, I mean, in Silicon Valley, it's interesting, before we even get to philanthropy, there is a claim that the business activity itself is not just making a buck, that the business activity itself is not just socially good, it is emancipatory.
Yes.
We are liberating mankind,
Right. Yeah.
through the making of our bucks, right? Facebook uses this rhetoric, Google uses this rhetoric, Tesla uses this rhetoric. They're all liberating mankind, right? They're all liberators. And first of all, we know from history, anytime anyone tells you they're a liberator of mankind, that's the person you should be most worried about. Right?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Easy lesson from history. So first of all, there's this claim, which is at the heart of the book. It's the idea of the win-win. They're making a claim that every dollar they make the society is becoming better off. So just letting them alone and letting them make money as much as they can make, as fast as they can make it, is to your and mine, everybody else's benefit. That's the first claim. While they're doing that, a lot of them are very interested, as a matter of course, in busting the structures that actually upheld a lot of middle class, working class security and prosperity in the middle of the 20th century. So you're using a rhetoric of emancipation while you're going after taxi unions that actually allowed people to not make minimum wage, which is now what is happening in New York with Uber and Lyft. You're going after, other types of unions. You saw Amazon, the world's richest man, $100 and something billion, but you can't afford paying, a union because you're afraid you're going to pay people a little more. So you go after the unions. You go after so much of the regulatory apparatus that the rest of business has been happy to play along with, or at least resigned to playing along with. And then the thing that does make it meaningfully different from the Carnegie, Rockefeller, like first generation of mega philanthropy 100 years ago, is that a lot of these people make this money when they're 28 or 30. So some of that first generation of philanthropy back in 100 years ago, these were like older guys who had kind of done the business part of life, made a bunch of money that was sitting in a pile behind them. And then there was this, like, Carnegie wrote a whole, his wealth gospel. There's this notion that, like, in the time of grandchildren and reading glasses, now's the time to give that pile away. And well, if you're 28, right, or 35 or 40, it's a different thing. You still, for all these people are still in the game, right? And they may be in the game for 20, 30, 40 more years, right? So then the philanthropy and the do-gooding becomes something more than just the penance or the legacy play. For someone like Mark Zuckerberg, the philanthropy is engine oil that is intended to lubricate ongoing business activity and, frankly, ongoing malfeasance, right? If Mark Zuckerberg did not give $300 million to help secure the election that he made less secure every day also, right? He might really be even more resented and even more trouble with the government than he is. If Jeff Bezos wasn't creating a free preschool for the kinds of poor children who are poor because people like Jeff Bezos don't pay their parents enough, he might face more support for the kind of unionizing efforts. So these younger fortunes that have marked the tech era are interesting because they really illustrate how this kind of elite do-gooding functions, is weaponized to very specifically and clearly help clear the path for these people to continue making money in the often obscene ways that they do.
Anand, if I could interject a question from the chat. Is there, this is from Stephen Goldsmith, does military expenditure have a particular impact on the philanthropy of the elite?
Military expenditure? What do you mean by that?
I'm just reading the question. I assume whether sort of the military industrial complex, whether that sort of plays into ideas of, either, needing more philanthropy or maybe providing that.
Well, one place to start with is certainly all types of people give away large amounts of money in America, but certainly one source is people who make their money in, defense contracting and weapons and things like that. Actually, the Aspen program that I described was funded from weapons money. It was the Crown family from Chicago, and that's I forget which company, Lockheed or Northrop Grumman or one of these families. I forget. Someone may know in the chat. And yeah, so and it's kind of, the details vary, but the storyline ends up being the same. So you make your money selling things that help people bomb Yemen or something like that. And then inevitably, sometimes you have some irrelevant program, but sometimes you have a very on the nose program, which is like you send 3 Yemeni girls every year to, like some Harvard summer camp. And now you feel like we're good. Like we bombed the 3,000 Yemeni girls, and then we got the 3 Yemeni girls at Harvard, and you sort of feel like you call it a day. And you know, you can look at fast food companies that build the playgrounds instead of thinking about changing the food, the soft drink companies that you know, will donate to some STEM campaign while still insisting on the right to, you know, predatorily market to 8-year-olds without state intervention. You know, you have folks in the finance industry. There's now this new effort called 90 to 0 to reduce the racial wealth gap that a lot of big finance Wall Street people are coming in. I mean, I love the idea of narrowing the racial wealth gap. What I don't like is the idea of Goldman Sachs, you know, which is one of the major players in this initiative, joining this initiative without any acknowledgement that it destroyed more Black wealth through its role in causing the financial crisis than this initiative is ever going to deal with. And I have seen zero plans for Goldman Sachs to change its ways, change how it operates, change its tax practices, change the, right? So a lot of Black families out there are not going to benefit from this 90 to 0 program because it's a small, ultimately small program in the scale of the US economy, but very much were affected, as virtually every family in this country was, by what Goldman Sachs chose to do in the run up to 2008. That pattern again and again of what you do over here, this kind of fraudulent attempt to erase it, to buy that indulgence. But it's inevitably at a much smaller scale, the do-goodings at a much smaller scale. And more importantly, it has this reputation laundering effect such that we, the public, get tricked. We get tricked. You know, someone like Jeff Bezos starts sprinkling a couple $2 billion here and there, which is for him nothing. And a lot of silence is bought. That's a lot of mayors who are really excited that some nonprofit in their town got a $500,000 grant. $500,000 grant to a small town nonprofit will probably buy you silence from a bunch of people. So you're spending $1 billion. How many people are becoming silent? Start adding that up, it's a lot of silence. There was a lot of excellent reporting done when Mike Bloomberg ran for mayor and then president, both times, that there was a really interesting correlation between who had endorsed him and institutions that had received money from him, or cities. They had some city prize. There's a really interesting correlation between mayors that had endorsed him and cities that had received money from Bloomberg philanthropies. So what I argue in the book is that generosity is so often the wingman of injustice. And this kind of making a difference is the wingman of making a killing. And the talk of changing the world functions as the wingman of fundamentally keeping the world the same for you and your plutocratic friends.
Well, thank you for that. As you speak, it makes me think of the role now that big corporations like the ones you've mentioned, the role they play in actually writing legislation for our Congress, our Senate. So there's that. And then you've mentioned the very overt kind of buying off of various voices. So as we maybe more ideally and look for a larger role in democratically elected government, you know, it makes me skeptical or concerned about how that happens, because it seems those in government are more reliant on the private sector, the logic of privatization and the logic of philanthropy to take care of, you know, these really community, social problems. I was just in San Francisco last week and was looking at a major construction project that will allow buses to go down the middle of a street. Now, apparently it's being constructed, it's been being constructed for about 7 years. And my very astute son was commenting that, you know, all the excitement about the Tesla loops would distract people from the notion that very few people will be able to get into these Tesla loops, but many, many more people in San Francisco need a well-functioning bus and Muni and BART kind of system. So do you have a way forward in working for a government that really takes responsibility for the common good for most people, rather than just the most fortunate among us?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that we're in the situation we're in because there has been a 40-year war on the idea of government. So we're not in the situation you describe out of happenstance, as you know. We're in that situation because of a very specific campaign that was waged. And actually, in the last few years, great books have been written detailing how that happened in even more kind of granularity than we knew before. So, Jane Mayer has a brilliant book called Dark Money that really tells the story going back 10, 15 years before Ronald Reagan is sworn in, of how a bunch of rich families on the political right, Richard Mellon Scaife and others, felt that the right and the business elite was out of power in this country, that the hair was long, the bell bottoms were wide, the hippies seemed to be taking over everything. Maybe we need to organize as a business community, get together with the Republican Party, partner with the evangelicals, and retake power on behalf of the kind of Chamber of Commerce interests in this country. Famous document called the Powell Memo that laid out a strategy for that. Kurt Anderson has a great new book called Evil Geniuses, also detailing that history. And they did it. Hats off to them. They did it. They were afraid. They were insecure. I think they've actually felt a lot, as Kurt makes the point, they felt a lot the way the left has felt in recent years. And they got organized. They built associations and institutes at universities and the Federalist Society, at law schools, and created law and economics programs at the University of Chicago, which they then replicated elsewhere. Association after association, clubs. They made sure that their kind of court thinkers like Charles Murray never wanted for anything. They really invested in their thinkers in a way that the left never does. And they built up to Ronald Reagan's inauguration. But more than that, he was only president 8 years. We've been living in his spell for 40 years. And the spell was captured in his opening inaugural address, where he says in the speech, government is not, at this moment, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Well, first of all, I imagine, Jane, when you took over this job, it would have been quite alarming if you had, said, universities are not the solution, universities are the problem. We might say, well, maybe someone else should be taking on Jane's job, right? So it's always a little dispiriting when the head of a most powerful government in human history doesn't think much of government. So he got in there. He did what he did in his 8 years. He slashed government, slashed taxes, set us on this path. But in the way that certain presidents do, the way FDR did prior to him, he set the intellectual boundaries of the conversation through this moment. You might hear on the right, government is kind of evil. But on the left, the kind of variant of that, thinking of like coronavirus variants, the kind of mutant strain of that was government is kind of regrettable, right? Bill Clinton said to me when I interviewed him for Winners Take All, he said, it's always better if you can solve a problem in the private sector. That's
Really?
what that's the variant. That's not the pure version of government is evil.
Yeah.
Right? That's someone who fundamentally believes in government, was a radical activist in the 1960s, but who sort of, hit his head against the wall enough times of this Republican consensus that he's fundamentally accepted it, right? And he's famously said, the era of big government is over. I don't think that's a sentiment that burned deeply in his heart. I think it's what it looks like when you're living in someone else's world.
Mhm.
Barack Obama, first new office he created in the White House, the Office of Social Innovation. It says on its website when he creates it, top-down programs from Washington aren't how you make change anymore. That's news to me. What a ridiculous statement. What a ridiculous, untrue statement coming from a liberal government. Barack Obama would not have been able to vote in this country without a very effective top-down program from Washington that was so effective that Republicans are still trying to gut it
To dismantle it,
to this
yes.
day. Top-down programs from Washington do work, but when you have this kind of forthright war on government from the right, and then this kind of capitulation to it on the left, you get a kind of anti-government consensus, soft here, hard over here, but a consensus. And the result you're talking about then, which is, why we have more, like Ubers than municipal buses, and you can change that analogy to any number of things, is because we've absorbed the lessons. That war had its consequences. Your students have absorbed the notion of certain kinds of work being more exciting than other types of work. I would imagine that a lot of your students are drawn to some of these entrepreneurial pitches of how you make a change, and are not drawn to, say, going to work at the Food and Drug Administration or something like that, which, frankly, you could have a lot more impact on millions of people's lives, but it's just not. Prior generations, the 60s, people might have been drawn to that. It's just not where people are, young, talented people are drawn to go make change now. And it's all because of this story. So my answer to your question is, we have to, as urgently as possible, start telling a different story. And I will say, Norbert introduced the Atlantic piece I wrote yesterday, published yesterday. I do think this is changing right now. And I don't think it's changing because Joe Biden, had a religious awakening one day. I think the country has changed and has woken up to the fraudulent narrative. I think 2008 helped wake it up, but I think COVID dramatically helped wake it up. Mike Donilon, one of the president's closest advisors, said to me, I don't think you can have 500,000 people die of something like this and not come out different as a country. We're changed as a country. And I think one of the ways in which the country is changing right now is shattering this Reagan consensus. And I really do believe we're on the brink of a new progressive era in this country. Again, not because, Joe Biden had a talk with his priest, but because the fundamentals of how this country works have so failed people for a generation that I don't think there's any gas left in the tank of that story. And I think people are starting to be open to new stories. And it's a very, very important moment to tell those stories and to tell fundamentally a story about government as a redemptive force that makes people's lives better.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very hopeful. It makes me reflect. You've mentioned universities a few times, and in Norbert's very generous introduction, he mentioned Cal State Long Beach is this is our proudest ranking, that we're so well thought of nationally in improving the economic mobility of our students, 60% of whom enter as Pell eligible students. And, we have a notion of ourselves at Long Beach and as the CSU system, educating, almost 500,000 students every year, that we can do things to reduce inequality. We can do stuff that will make the world better. I wonder if you've done some thinking about how higher education or education fits in your larger argument about reframing this narrative.
I think it's very interesting. I mean, first of all, I think public universities play such a particularly important role in this. Because, it's that, for many families, it's that pivot point, right? I mean, it's where someone can show up without a history of any connection to the power establishment of this country and be brought within a place where you can access that world and you can be discovered and you can discover yourself and you can train yourself. And it's such an important kind of meeting point between talent and the world. I often feel like, particularly when I go to, universities where, as at yours, there's this kind of high fraction of students from lower income backgrounds or first generation college students. I often feel like I'm arriving in this island that is just has this enormous gravitational pull in this much larger community. If you can just get to, I have this feeling of if you can just get to this place, so much can happen, right? It's not easy to get to the plate. If you can just get to the plate, if you can just get on campus somehow, the world's there. And, you know, the kind of social mobility numbers you have are very impressive, and they're quite rare, you know? And places like Harvard, which frankly could afford, in a way that you can't, to do social mobility much better than you can, right? Because Harvard could throw billions and billions of dollars at the problem, right? You don't have that luxury. In theory, it should be much easier for Harvard to do it, right? Harvard could give everybody a free ride. Harvard could do, you know, could get rid of debt and any number of things. Could do better outreach, could stop doing legacy, any number of things. And so much of the kind of elite college infrastructure is a privilege replication machine, has become that more so, actually, over the last generation. There's more diversity, but there's more upper middle class, upper class kind of class replication. And I think universities are the perfect laboratory, because it's where all of this stuff comes together. It's where, you know, big mega donors love university. And there's a reason Jeffrey Epstein was focusing on universities, not the ballet, right? And the reason is, what a lot of the worst plutocrats, you know, AKA Jeffrey Epstein, what a lot of the worst ones need is a real reputational scrub, right? It's not just like,
Of course, yeah.
It's not just like giving back a little bit, right? It's like, and you know, I need that scrub so I can go on doing what I'm doing, or I need that scrub so I can keep selling the opioids, or like some of these people have real ongoing needs or real ongoing potential trouble. They can get arrested this year if they don't find their way into polite society and get some powerful friends, right? As when Epstein moved to New York after his legal trouble in Florida some years ago. And that's when the university gifts start. Why? Because there's this perfect marriage between universities and some of these plutocrats. The plutocrats have a surplus of money, obviously, and often a deficit of prestige, right? And what do universities have? Enormous surplus of prestige, right? All these academics doing brilliant path-breaking work that's not for any gain, that's just for the intrinsic value of it. Like, universities have more prestige than they know what to do with, and always need more money. And so this alliance forms of plutocrats being willing to share some of their surplus money, and universities being essentially willing to sell them surplus prestige. And we have to reckon with the fact that in many of these cases, and the Epstein case with Harvard and MIT is so clear, what the universities are selling is a tool, knowingly, that those people are going to use, put in their back pocket, and literally go do bad stuff the next day. This is not like a gift. This is a service that is being sold.
This is a get out of jail free card, huh? Or don't go to jail free. Yeah.
Yes.
That was a surprisingly sort of market-based explanation, considering sort of, you know, your proclivities and approach.
I like to meet people where they are.
Okay. If you don't mind, if I could rewind a little and bring up some of the questions from the chat.
Please.
Praveen Shankar was asking whether he wasn't quite sure if we understood this correctly, that you were saying that the Rockefellers and the Carnegies were somehow different or better than the plutocrats of today, or it's the same
No,
structure?
I was saying different, not better. So it's a good thing we should talk about. So 100 years ago plus, the model emerged with that generation of, you know, and you really had not had, you'd have charity, which is as old as time, all the religions call for it, but philanthropy is the way that the term is used, is really about 100 some years old. These big fortunes, kind of what we'd recognize as billionaires today, whether or not they were dollar billionaires at the time. And one way that I think scholars think about how to define that new phenomenon about 100 years ago is that when those folks like the Carnegies and Rockefellers and Cooper started giving money away, it was quasi-governmental, just because of the scale at which they were doing it. They were applying scientific methods. Like it wasn't like almsgiving of the past. It wasn't, you know, coconuts at the temple. Like any of the number of forms that charity has taken throughout human history. This was like very rich people being like, I'm going to solve X problem. And on day one, they were one of the biggest players in the world on whatever issue they'd picked, bigger than any state government, right? Competing with the federal government on. That is kind of how we started to understand philanthropy. So there's an element of continuity from that to the present, to the questioner's point. The element of continuity is that then as now, and Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth is which I write about in the book, is a, you know, eloquent thesis articulating this point, is they used latter-day generosity, they weaponized latter-day generosity to justify anything goes capitalism. So that is a straight line from that. So no, I'm not saying those people are better by any means. I mean, in many ways they were worse. I mean, you could shoot strikers in the back in those days. I mean, these days that's less common, you know, to have like murders during a union union situation. But there's that basic notion that leave us alone to make money however we got to make the money. It's hard out there to be a plutocrat. And then we will promise we give back. So that is very much the same story. What I was just suggesting is different, is that I think it just has to do with like people weren't making those fortunes when they were 31 back then, right? And just as a matter of history, just didn't, even if they were quite rich, like it just, the history of when some of these people turned their mind to the question of giving back was just, it was like a late in life thing. And so it was approached, like, I don't think Carnegie, let me put it this way. I don't think Carnegie, when Carnegie set about, or Rockefeller set about to give the money away, I don't think they were also thinking about how do I double my wealth. I think it was a little more phased.
Thank
right?
you. Okay.
I think part of what has changed now, and just adds an additional complication, is you have these younger fortunes, this entrepreneurial wealth, is that you now have people who are like, the elements of continuity, I've made a bunch of money, I want to give back for moral reasons, for virtue reasons, for reputation laundering, for whatever. But there's another element in the mix, which is like also like, I really got to get into the Chinese market. And that senator on the Foreign Relations Committee does not like me because I ruined democracy. Maybe I got to do a Boys and Girls Club in Connecticut so I can get into the Chinese market.
So then a related question that came up in various forms in the chat, are there any good models of philanthropy out there? One person, Bhupen Mehta, mentioned something called service space, a gentleman called Nipun Mehta, I assume in India, on the Gandhian model. Are there good philanthropies out there?
Sure, and I think the way I would think about it is, again, and my book is really focused on the US because I think these issues are specific to specific places. And this notion of replacing government with private sector, coin throwing is quite American. I mean, this is not like France doesn't work this way. So I don't, generalize. Also in a place like India, the government is not up to the task of doing some of the things that I would expect the United States government to be able to do in 2021. So you have to make a kind of society-specific analysis of these things. Although some of the trends are universal. But what I would say is, in general, in the United States right now, there is, in a better run country, there would be less money to give away. There would be less need to give it. There'd be fewer problems in need of it. But I'm a realist. I understand we live down here in the sublunary world where there is this money now. There are these people, and there are better and worse ways to give. And so the simple answer I would say is there are some ways to give in this moment that would fundamentally serve to erode plutocracy, erode the system atop which that wealth is standing, erode the opportunity for someone else to ever get that rich ever again. And there's other forms of giving that are neutral on that point, or worse, fundamentally serve to shore up the system, right? Now, I'll give you just a couple examples of each. So if you are selling opioids in shady ways, you're giving to a university, you're getting naming rights, you're getting a tax deduction, and then you're continuing to sell the opioids. That's at like the far end of like philanthropy that is not only not good, but that we are made worse by each gift. We would be much better off in that case if you just bought a yacht, right? Like we are made worse by the gift. I want to make that very, in that case, right? Because if your reputation wasn't scrubbed, the regulatory authorities might come for you faster. If your reputation wasn't scrubbed, there might be Senate hearings on the opioid crisis faster. If your reputation wasn't scrubbed, there may be more outrage. So that's kind of at one end. Now think about if you start structuring the gifts differently. Let's say you're instead giving to, I often use this example, ProPublica. Okay, you're supporting investigative journalism against the powerful. A couple things have now changed. No one knows that you're doing this. I mean, ProPublica does not, I mean, you can tell people, like in that Curb Your Enthusiasm episode, but generally, it's not a public thing. They're not naming the articles after you. I'm pretty sure ProPublica is not going to go easy on your friends, certainly not going to go easy on your class, just because they got that money from you. And fundamentally, the kind of reporting that ProPublica does makes it harder to be a plutocrat with impunity than it does, so that's and let's add to that, make up a scenario where like you wouldn't even get a tax deduction for that. If we were to move it in that direction, I would say the tendency of that gift at the margin would be to push the society in a systemically better direction. Or, are you running your own Bill Gates style health program where you are going in and rich-splaining to communities how they should run their health program? Or are you running a political training program, funding a political training program where you're teaching people, like graduates from Long Beach to, run for office so that people who, are first-time college students and their families are not only first-time college students, but then like AOC are running for office, winning elections at a higher rate. That's the kind of thing, that's not going to perpetuate you and your friends' privilege. If more people like that are winning elective office, that pushes the country in a way that's potentially bad for you and your rich friends. And that's good. That is actually trying to change the system. If people were to do philanthropy that advocates for a wealth tax, right? A lot of people read my book in these circles and like, Anand, we totally agree with you. We're totally down. What can we do? I'm like, it's quite interesting. None of you ever gravitate to, raising $1 billion fund from all these rich people to fund a campaign for a wealth tax. By the way, you talk about return on investment, another market concept these people love. I bet you for $1 billion of advocacy, the numbers are already very good on a wealth tax, actually. Republicans like it too. For $1 billion, I bet you could move that number in a really significant way. You could get that done, possibly. You'd get like $1 trillion in the first year. Spend $1 billion, you get $1 trillion in the first year for the public good. That's a pretty good return on investment, better than Silicon Valley. Quite interesting, isn't it, that all these people claim they want justice, but Bill Gates says taxes should be raised. Has he ever funded an organization to advocate for higher taxes on people like him? So there are plenty of ways to give that fundamentally serve to break down these structures. Somehow these people just can never find the door to them.
Well, I love the term rich-splaining. That's another great neologism, so thank you for that. And then a related question, I think, from Arvind. Do you know, are there examples of societies that have gone through the kind of crazy inequity that we're experiencing right now and have come through that and back to a more equitable model?
Well, I mean, we have in different ways, right? I mean, I think part of what I'm trying to suggest in the book is that we ought to look at our history instead of this market ideology as a source of understanding of how we got here, right? I would bet, back when, once when walking around your campus is a thing that people are doing, I would bet if you look around your campus, most of those people could not have been there in a prior incarnation of America. Pretty sure Jane wouldn't have been the head of the university in another incarnation of America. Pretty sure those Pell Grants didn't exist in another incarnation of America. Pretty sure a lot of those, immigrant students you have, or children of immigrant students, parents couldn't have immigrated here, prior to 1965. Pretty sure that none of those things that allowed any of those people to be there at your campus happened because hyper-privileged people woke up feeling nice one day and decided to throw scraps of their privilege. All of those things happened because of policy, law, and movements fighting for them, right? We know how we made America more just, more free, more open. We know it's a documented history, right? We know how we changed the immigration laws. We know what the civil rights movement did for African Americans. We know why kids don't work in factories anymore. There was a day when they were working in factories still, and then there was a day after that where they were not working in factories anymore. And it wasn't because factory owners got woke. It was because we yanked from them the opportunity to employ children. And they, to a factory owner, probably did not like it on that first day.
For a second there, I thought you were going to say how we made America great in the first place, but you didn't go there, so that was good. And can I ask? Tim brought up the question. Do you think that or the impact of the COVID crisis on the reputation of government is that? Do you think that the government's handling of COVID is sort of helping to undermine that old Reaganite promise or consensus? Or is it not, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, before we even get to the response, let's just think about COVID itself. Because one of the, if you're being very sincere about what is government actually for, right? Because in this country in particular, you really do have, it's not just big corporations pushing this. You have a sincerely held ideology, widespread in this country, that it is better to be left alone to your rugged individualism and solve your problems for yourself. So I push back against big companies just laundering their interests, but I take seriously the intuitions of large numbers of my fellow citizens. A lot of people feel that way. I meet them, I interview them, I talk to them about it. We got to deal with that intuition. And that intuition grows out of our history. It grows out of, the independence struggle in this country. If you read the Declaration of Independence, I mean, it wasn't the worst set of oppressions in the history of mankind that they were, talking about, like the tea tax, they were very hypersensitive from the very beginning of this country to centralized power, and that we've just retained that heritage while being blind to all other types of oppressions that we're totally chill about. So we have this history in this country of just being very afraid of government. So if we were to start to say, okay, what is the case for government? Where can we agree there should be government? I think one simple definition is it steps in areas where people are being acted on by forces that they are individually or even as communities too powerless to respond to alone. Okay, so in the in-between cases, we're going to have a bunch of arguments, right? Is air conditioning something the government should provide? Because the heat, and a lot of people are going to feel different ways about air conditioning. But there's some really easy cases where there's no case to be made that the market or your neighborhood or your family can muster a response. And COVID is you all are teachers, COVID is like a teaching example. If you were just trying to make up a hypothetical of something where no person could say there was any kind of solution below the level of a coordinated government response. COVID is like the paradigmatic case, right? More than even the financial crisis of 2008 was, more than the great, it's just there's just no story you can tell besides the government being absolutely necessary to deal with the economic ravages of it, to deal with the actual health crisis itself, to lead vaccination efforts, et cetera. And so just COVID itself has, I think, revealed a lot to people. and revealed things about, for example, the moral kind of catastrophe of something like employer-based healthcare. I think it is becoming clearer to people that requiring people to currently have a job on a Tuesday to get a doctor's appointment on a Wednesday is sort of like requiring me to, have chicken in my fridge in order to be able to get on the subway. Like, what do they have to do with each other? What do they have to do with each other? You need healthcare, you need healthcare. Who cares whether you have a job on a Tuesday, right? And that's become really, really clear to large numbers of people. The Medicare for All numbers are really much higher than several years ago. Then there's the issue of the response. I think the response under Trump militated against that kind of faith in government, but to Joe Biden's credit, and I think a lot of it has to do with his chief of staff, Ron Klain, being a pandemic seasoned expert. They have just really put basic competence as the first order of business in what they're doing. A lot of kind of under promising and over delivering in terms of the vaccine numbers and whatever. And what you're seeing is like the greatest advertisement just for government that we could have ever imagined. I'm not happy that it had to happen this way. But I think with literally virtually every American getting a shot in the arm because of one of the biggest government programs in history, I hope it will be harder for people to sustain the fantasy that this thing called the government is the biggest threat to their freedom.
Okay, great. That sounds great. And I think Manisha Rao in the chat is sort of saying something similar to what you started out with, that it's all about raising awareness and bringing about transformational change, which can only happen when people come together and fight for that. And then since we're sort of, looking forward right now, Anil Pandya is asking, what do you mean in concrete terms when we talk about a progressive era, given the experience of the collapse of communism and the turn of China to state capitalism? And then somebody earlier in the chat, and I'm sorry I didn't write down the name, was talking about potential inefficiencies in union labor. So what does progressivism or a progressive society or era look like?
I think the era that I believe we're on the brink of is defined by the reclaiming of government as a redemptive force that can make people's lives better. Now, for some people listening to this, that's not a radical proposition. You may believe that all along, but I don't think that's been the dominant assumption of the age. I don't think that was the assumption, operative consensus, when Bill Clinton said the era of big government is over. And so I think the seedbed of a new progressive era is first and foremost believing in government. And then there's the question of like, what should the government do now that people believe in it? And given where we are as a country, I wouldn't have the same answer in every country at every moment. It depends on what the situation is. In this moment, at this time, we have been living in oligarchic conditions. So one of the first orders of business for that government, if it is able to reclaim that authority, is to rebalance things, is to redistribute wealth and power downward, is to import the American dream from Europe so that it's something we have here, not just over there. And that's going to require very, very aggressive social policy on a number of levels. I mean, I love the statistics Jane was talking about your university. Unfortunately, we got to do that for the whole damn country, right? The country does not look like your university when it comes to social mobility. It just doesn't. The country's in the opposite. The country, and it's funny, if you just stop an American on the street and you say, I think if you were to ask the average American on the street, 20 rich countries, which country is social mobility the highest? Which country does your parents' livelihood least predict where you end up. I think most Americans on the street would be like, we're number one on that. And not just because we always like to say we're number one. I think a lot of people would sincerely believe like on that thing, we're definitely number one. We may be bad at this, we may be bad at that, but on that thing, that's the whole thing. That's our thing. That's like our thing. Our thing is that like the past doesn't hold you down. The past is not a ball and chain. You make your own fate. Well, we're literally ranked last in that among the rich countries, right? We're the most un-American. If that is the American dream, we're the most un-American of the rich countries. I think a lot of Americans don't understand that we're the most un-American of the rich countries when it comes to what we call the American dream. And so governments can have to do a tremendous number of things to restore that promise, to make this the kind of country where people can flourish, thrive, have dignity, regardless of where they are in that ladder, but also have opportunities to climb that ladder, to fulfill their talents, to fulfill their dreams. A country in which most people with a business idea are no longer imprisoned in their job they hate and thwarted from starting that idea because they would lose their health care if they went and chased their dream. A country in which, you know, we don't see women dropping out of the labor force at alarming rates because it's cheaper to stay home than to get childcare for your 3 and 5-year-old. So, you know, a country where that racial wealth gap is solved not by Goldman Sachs doing a small little, you know, token program, but through reparations and other far-reaching public policies. So, you know, I think a new progressive era starts with just that re-legitimization of government, but then has to quickly go on to make measurable, palpable improvements in people's lives, so that it's not just the story we're telling, but something people feel. And the last thing I'll say on that is, you know, I think it's very important for progressives who want that era to come, who want those changes to come, to understand how to communicate to those Americans who are not entirely sold on that vision yet. Again, it's not just big corporations and big media. That's a big part of the story, but it's also a lot of people who don't want to give up their employer-based healthcare. It's also a lot of people who feel like they paid for college and they don't want someone else's debt wiped away. We have to persuade those people. We have a massive persuasive challenge ahead of us if a promise of a new progressive era is to be realized.
And then, so there's another question related coming in. How can one have faith in the government when government is also doing things like taking away people's basic right to vote in places like Georgia? And I guess also sort of a concrete thing that happened recently, or, you know, last few days, Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. How do those fit into this narrative of reclaiming or re-legitimizing government, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think government is like your family, and like it's not particularly substitutable. So, you know, when your family's not working right, you try to make your family work better. You know, when your government's not working right, you try to make it work better. You don't go solve the problem elsewhere. I mean, if it's really not right, you may abandon your family, or you may move to another country. But, you know, let's be clear, all these voting things are also because of the plutocratic capture of government. So to me, that's not proof that you don't turn to civic activism and government to solve problems. It's proof that we've ceded that space to powerful interests that have an interest in Republicans winning elections where they're not popular. And that's, to me, all the more reason we got to get up in there, right? That's the alarm bell that we got to get up in there. That's the alarm bell that we got to organize more people than they have. And it's an important point the questioner brings up. Government is not always going to do the things you want, but it is to be philosophical for a second, it is the collective expression of your society, right? It is the only institution, and you know, there's multiple levels of it, but the state, to speak philosophically again, it's the only institution that is able to speak on behalf of everybody to do some common purpose. And it may sometimes do wrong things. And that doesn't, to me, create a case for desertion. That creates a case for making it do the right things and recognizing that too many of us have treated democracy as a supermarket where you kind of pop in whenever you need something. And I think we have to think about it more like a farm where you reap what you sow. And if you're not invested in it, if you're not involved, if you're not organizing, if you're not an active citizen, then you're leaving its operations and machinery to often very malicious actors who are very happy to be civically active on your behalf.
And then Pravina Cooper asked, to what extent is this model exportable from the US? I mean, I know your book and our discussion tonight has focused mostly on the US. Is this something that other countries can aspire to, and particularly poorer countries, where on the one hand, government works very differently, and also there's lots of interference from external powers, from the US historically to China's initiatives now. So is this sort of a internationally scalable model, I guess?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think anything is, can be copy and pasted anywhere. I mean, that's why I don't write like Malcolm Gladwell books that are just, claim to be about everything for everyone. I mean, I wrote a book about America in a specific moment for that reason. What I do think is probably somewhat common is that in any country in the world, I don't think there's a substitute for collective action on a certain set of problems. What those problems are is going to vary. The effectiveness of particular governments may vary. There may be a case in places with really weak governments. There may be more of a case for philanthropy or private initiative because frankly, there just isn't state capacity, which is obviously not the issue in the US. I think a lot about India, where I lived for 6 years after college, worked as a New York Times correspondent. The issues in India are incredibly different. But broadly, the notion of generosity not being a substitute for justice, it was a deeply true statement in India also. And, it's true at a micro level and a macro level. India is kind of very much going in the American direction of a lot of billionaires and lots of people kind of stuck in the bottom 2/3 of society, never rising. It's a society in which rich people will tell you, how much they gave for their servants' roof collapse in Bihar last week, and how proud they are that they bought their driver's son a new scooter and this and that. But it never occurs to anybody that maybe that driver or servant should be paid the minimum wage, subject to labor laws, given breaks, not summoned in the middle of the night, actually to have some kind of dignity of labor. It never occurs to people that you might advocate for systems that would not actually have a 12-year-old, cleaning your house. And so I think this basic notion of turning to public systems to solve our biggest problems is important. And one last thing I'll say about India that really came together in my book was that a lot of the way the conventional narrative is told about the rise and prosperity of modern India since 1990 is told as a story of the opening of the market, the unshackling of the market, right? And that's kind of like the Goldman Sachs narrative. And there's a lot of truth to it. India did open the market in 91. And that's a big part of what happened. The world came in, globalization, the reduction of a lot of government controls on, socialist controls on parts of the economy. But, that's not the entire story. And around that same time, India embarked on one of the most aggressive affirmative action programs in the history of humankind on caste, setting aside, sometimes 49% of university seats, certain types of government jobs for historically downtrodden castes, and doing any number of other social engineering things, National Rural Employment Guarantee, farm price supports for farmers, that built on previous nation building things that were very much not, free market. And the story is then told like, they opened the market and like all was well. Well, like they did a mix of things actually. And I think that's true if you look at China. The market was let in and the government did a lot of very aggressive things to empower all kinds of people. And, China's real victories in lower elementary, secondary education, which India failed at. So we also have to make sure that when we're telling the stories of these other countries, we're not telling a market world story that isn't grounded in reality. I think what is true around the world is that you need some combination of a functioning market that creates prosperity for people, that allows people to realize their dreams, and vigorous public action that creates rules of the roads, redresses wrongs, and gives people the opportunity to kind of show up at the marketplace whole and healthy and able to trade.
Thank you. And as we sort of start moving towards wrapping up, I just want to mention, and I haven't been able to mention all these, there's a lot of confirmation in the chat as well, and different examples of either things that are really not going well, like comparing it to the mafia, extorting people and simultaneously giving money to the church, to positive examples like the CSU system and the UC system in California. And then one of the later questions that came up, would a way of legitimizing government be to do representation by lottery? Is that something you've thought about at all or seen as a model somewhere?
I think it's interesting. I mean, among the priorities, I think it's a low one just because our Constitution is so hard to amend that generally I think we got to focus on what we can do within it. I think there's a lot we can do within it. I think it's an interesting idea. There's other ideas like ranked choice voting and things like that actually, could be done more easily within our system. I think they're all very interesting. I haven't given that one particular thought, but I think a more basic version of that is having more regular people cycle in and out of office, which I think you'd have if you've reformed money in politics, if you took fundraising out of this picture, if you reduce some of the incumbency protection that happens in politics. Lotteries are a particular way of doing, I think, a broader thing, which is just trying to have regular people in government, which is what AOC did to great acclaim. I don't think a lottery is the only way to achieve that goal. I think having a reformed political system that opened up the opportunity to run to more people would go a long way.
And then a different Tim is asking to what extent media might be part of the problem, and whether a return to some version of the fairness doctrine is even possible or could contribute towards a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think the media is very much responsible for a lot of these things, and I say that as a citizen of the media. I think there's a real problem with cable and with there's different problems, right? I mean, the Fox News problem is disinformation, brain mashing, and incitement of violence. So that's a very particular problem that we need to deal with. And frankly, I've raised the question. I didn't get a lot of I didn't get a lot of amens with this one, but I've raised the question about whether Fox News should be allowed to exist. I'm not sure that brain mashing, disinformation, and incitement as a business model is necessarily protected speech under the First Amendment. But that wasn't one of my more popular questions. I think we have a more general problem with cable of just obviously the sound bites, the arguments, and not necessarily educating people about public policy in a deeper way. And we have this bigger problem of we choose in this country to get information from media that is owned by big corporations that have a very vested interest in not doing the kind of fundamental change that I'm talking about here tonight. And so I think it's going to be really important to figure out other models, but there are a lot of other models out there. There's a lot of citizen funded stuff. I mean, one of the reasons I have a newsletter is to create an experiment around, not having to ask people for permission to put things in the world, while still retaining a kind of foothold in that world of journalism also, which is useful because editing is good. And, you reach different people than your own followers. But I think, there's no way to get to the next America without thinking through what a media that would support that transition would look like, and that would help actually build real check on power, that would help us tell new stories of cohesion, and that would really beat back disinformation. I think I saw someone in the chat say, it's very hard to have a country if we don't agree on a set of facts. And it's okay to interpret things differently. It's okay to even minorly have different facts in the sense of like, I think you can have, you can have different versions of events of something like, was the Reagan Revolution good for the economy or not? Is a complicated interpretive question, and even the facts are, can be spun in any number of ways. It's fine. We should argue about that. But that's not where we are. We're in a place where a lot of people think COVID is not real. Like we're in a place where a lot of people think it's like a Chinese op, and their brains have been mashed by a very elaborate corporate disinformation machine by Rupert Murdoch and others. And we have to deal with that very seriously if we want to have any prospect of continuing to be a self-governing country.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. I see that we're out of time. I just saw Dr. Kern appear on the screen. No, I'm sure it was to remind us about our time limits. And you've given us so much to think about, so much provocative information. And I really commend everyone to take a look both at your newsletter, the.inc, and also your first two books, India Calling and The True American, as well as Winners Take All, because I think it will be a way to kind of reorient lots of our thinking about what we're experiencing and give us some sense of direction. So thank you for everybody who's been participating, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Kern.
Yeah, I just want to thank Anand. Really fantastic. Really. Oh, am I on? Am I? Can
You're
hear me?
there.
I'm
You're
sorry.
there.
Okay, my bad. Yeah, I could think of a jillion more questions, and we'd go way too late, particularly about how do we untangle these things from the globalization in which all this stuff arose. But that's for another conversation. We will be sending out an invitation to get a copy of his book because they're in my office. So we will send out to everybody who's participated so you can read Winners Take All for yourselves. But let's thank Anand and Jane for an excellent conversation. I'd also like to thank Norbert for his fantastic moderation. And most of all, I want to thank everybody in the chat who had these really awesome and purposeful and really good questions. All right, thank you, everybody. And hopefully the next Solanki lecture, we may see each other in an actual space as opposed to a virtual one. Let's hope. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.